Hi, I'm Russ Thrall, publisher and editor-in-chief of CollisionWeek, and with me today is Bob Redding, the Automotive Service Association's Washington representative. Bob, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Well, Bob, let's talk a little bit about autonomous vehicle legislation. There's been some activity, I know, at the federal level that you've been involved in. Could you talk a little bit about the legislation and what the issues are?
Sure. As you know, the autonomous vehicle legislation in the House passed the committee 54-0. Bipartisan bill, can you believe that, with no dissenters, and then went to the floor under what they call a suspension of the rules, and it passed without amendment. Senate committee takes up their bill, which is very similar, and off we go. But the Senate bill, and this is really important for us as collision repairers and in the collision industry, the Senate bill included an amendment by Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma that created a federal advisory committee at NHTSA, also staffed by the Federal Trade Commission, to work on data access and cybersecurity issues as they relate to the aftermarket. And we were pleased that language is included in the Senate bill.
And that's, I mean, the access to data, they've talked about cybersecurity, and there's kind of reasons that kind of clamp down on it.
Yes.
But the concern is, from the repairer's perspective, do you have access to whether it's, you know, all the stuff we're talking about with diagnostics and car systems? That's what the concerns are, right?
Exactly. And part of the issue has, as you know, summer or so ago, we had several hackings, very public. We had a letter last around the holidays in 16 from the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee to NHTSA, very concerned about hacking vehicles. And what were they doing about it? Very much focused on the vehicle owner, their privacy issues. And our issue has to do with, we understand the security issues. We want to participate, whether it's best management practices or a state or federal legislation, a state or federal law. But critical to us is having access to the data, and that we are protected and can continue to do business and repair cars.
So this committee that they're talking about creating, their
Yes.
charge would be to
develop a report working with NHTSA and the Federal Trade Commission and report back to Congress within 2 years. And that would lay out, those are very formal processes. They're public. The information is public. You have voting members of the committee. We felt like all segments of the aftermarket were covered, from car leasing companies to auto repairers to distributors and parts manufacturers. And the goal was to be inclusive, and consumers, to be an inclusive committee, not an exclusive committee. And these issues need to be talked about. One thing that, Russell, concerned us a little bit had to do with this fall there was a public workshop on AV issues at the Federal Trade Commission, co-hosted by the Federal Trade Commission and NHTSA. They talked about a lot of things in the committee. They didn't have any aftermarket people on the panels for a full-day conference. They didn't have any repairers. And that's okay, but it really created a stir within the aftermarket that our issues are very important. We're a huge industry, and we want to make sure that the policymakers know exactly the kinds of things that we have to have, processes that work for us, and that we exist.
I know, in talking with the folks in the diagnostic equipment business, certainly that's a big issue, you know, today, that there's been concern that some of the proposals and the way they're changing, you know, the diagnostic port that exists today is a security risk and wasn't designed to do all the things that we're asking it to do today, that, you know, they might change the way, and there's concern about being locked out and having the access to data. That's a good portion of what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. And we have two groups that have been meeting and talking that work really well together so far. But we're going to continue to meet. The automakers, through the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, Wayne Weichel on our program this week at CIC, and global automakers, which encompasses all the companies, and our aftermarket telematics task force, which are repairers, distributors, and parts manufacturers, Equipment and Tool Institute. And we're talking and trying to figure out our needs, and also what protections are necessary for the consumer. And that's been very, very helpful. Of course, everything's not resolved because we don't know where all the technology is going to be yet. But that's something that we need to continue and continue talking and trying to find an industry solution to these issues.
Now, I know you made an announcement about you joining there's a coalition for future mobility. Could you talk a little bit about that and that group?
Sure. That coalition, the automakers are members, we're members, they're disability groups, all supporters of moving legislation forward, particularly at this point, dealing with preemption, determining who's going to make the laws in this zone, this space, states and the federal government, or the federal government or the state government. As you know, we had a gap. Last couple of years, we've had a lot of legislative activity at the state level dealing with connected cars, autonomous vehicles, all over the place. Not just research, but research and deployment. The Fed, NHTSA felt like, whoa, this is kind of getting out of control here. In 2016, they came up with guidelines. States, this is your space. Licenses, vehicle safety inspection, salvage, those kind of issues. And our space is going to be vehicle safety, AV policy. That was in August, September of 16. This past September, the Trump administration, a new administration, came in and issued a follow-up set of guidelines. And it's not law, but it does say to states and state DMVs and state policymakers, these are the areas that we should be working for states and for the Fed. And there were some clarifications on a preemption issue in the Trump document, and also some definitional kind of items that needed to be included that were not included in the Obama administration document in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
That just came out.
It just makes sense. You don't want to have a car that meets the standards in one state and not another on the technical
cross state
side.
line.
It won't work anymore, and it
Correct.
would be legal. Yeah,
Exactly.
that would make a lot of sense. At the time, it just seemed like they were trying to compete to get research facilities and established and boost their tech economy.
Probably some of that, yes.
Bob, could you talk a little bit about the Federal Insurance Office and any the activity going on there?
Yes. The Federal Insurance Office was created as part of the Dodd-Frank financial legislation several years ago. It started out being a much bigger authorized initiative agency at the U.S. Department of Treasury. As it went through the legislative process, it was diluted. And frankly, it became more of an agency that tracked industries in the insurance area, worked a lot on international areas, still deferred to the states as far as their regulatory authority. Jeb Hensling, who's retiring chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, wanted to repeal or reform Dodd-Frank and introduce a bill which has passed the House that would repeal the Federal Insurance Office. It creates an insurance advocate, similar to what we see in some states like the consumer advocate, this kind of thing. But it really diluted this Federal Insurance Office agenda even more. It did pass the House, has stalled in the Senate. We've been hopeful today that this working relationship on Dodd-Frank reform between Chairman Mike Crapo of Idaho and Senator Brown of Ohio, the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, which has jurisdiction over all these insurance issues. They were working together on a reform package, which we have been led to believe that, or have assumed through conversations and meetings, that it would not include a repeal of the Federal Insurance Office. My understanding as of the first part of this week that that package is not coming together now and is certainly in limbo if it happens at all, and that creates some concern about whether efforts to repeal the FIO or Federal Insurance Office will be revived in the Senate. If that's the case, that's a great concern to us. We like the concept of a two-track regulatory authority. In some states, for small businesses and consumers, the state-based system works great. In some states, it does not work so great. And having a separate Federal Insurance Office to go to on issues of concern, like just frankly, areas where we could see studies would be most favored nation clauses offered by some insurers, which are very much a detriment to many repairs. And there are other areas where now we have to go to GAO, the Government Accountability Office, for parts review and the impact on consumers with parts choice and notice and written consent legislation and policy. It would be a better, more central place to go to for us than going to a GAO or trying to go through NHTSA.
Now, the insurance office itself, if in your conversations with them, I mean, is there any traction on some of these issues and bringing them to the front, or is...
Well, they've done one property and casualty report. We've made our case for others, and we're very hopeful. Right now, things are a little in limbo since you have a House passed bill that eliminates them. You have no approved director, no nominated or chosen director. You have an acting. These are career employees that are there now. The Obama appointee is no longer there, and President Trump has not made an appointment yet. So I'm not sure you'll see too much of a broadening of agenda until they have a politically appointed executive director in place.
Bob, I guess on the state level for a lot of legislatures, we're at the end of a cycle, so there's not much happening now, but
that's correct.
We want to start paying attention at the start of the year?
That's right. Their states have wrapped up, most states. There's some that are still active, but most of the state legislation has wrapped up for the year. So now we're even into pre-filing and early kind of process of who's going to introduce what for the first quarter of 2018. And we anticipate maybe some crash parts bills like we saw last year, multiple states, where, as you know, going back to the 90s, we had a small number of states that passed notice and written consent for the use of crash parts legislation. And we saw several bills last year to try and repeal those. Arkansas was probably the most high profile. It did not become law. We anticipate we'll see some of those again in 2018. Probably more in the space of the AV area and cybersecurity. We still believe, because even though the federal government has given guidelines for the states to stay out of it, it's not law, so they can do their own thing. And in many states' views, it's going to be about, well, the Fed has not stepped forward, we're going to do it. So those will be the two of the key areas, and we always have activity on insurance reform at the state level, steering, those kind of things.
And back on the AV piece, it seems that consumer groups are of two minds. There's those that are pushing for autonomous vehicles because they see the benefit to safety and pedestrians and just in general that this is a great out there. But then the flip side is there's a concern from some in the safety community that NHTSA is, abdicating its responsibility to regulate safety because they haven't developed standards for these systems that don't exist yet.
That's exactly right. And NHTSA, as you know, does not have an administrator yet. They have a Secretary of the Department of Transportation, but we have not seen a nominee to go through the Senate confirmation process. Until that happens, I think it's unlikely for NHTSA to step forward with anything beyond the most basic items. So all indications are for us in the aftermarket, they're not going to address data access or cybersecurity for collision repair until Congress tells them to do so. Or, this is important, or they have a confirmed NHTSA administrator says, we're going to take the bull by the horns and we're going to do this.
Set a direction.
Yeah, exactly. So once we have an administrator, members of the Senate, members of the House will be more inclined to send a letter to NHTSA and say, what about this? And I think, and same with consumer groups and auto repair groups.
Bob, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you. It's always great to see you, and enjoyed our visit.
Thank you.
Okay.